Prime Field.
This is not a revenge season. This is not a run-it-back season. And this is definitely not a transition year UConn can quietly hide inside. This is the first real look at what UConn basketball becomes after the Paige, Bueckers, and Azzi Fudd era. And the reason this season feels different is simple. For the first time in years, UConn's identity is no longer built around elite guard gravity. Now it is built around pressure. Pressure on Sarah Strong to become the centerpiece of the entire program. Pressure on Geno Auriemma to redesign the offense around new strengths. Pressure on young players to mature immediately against one of the hardest non-conference schedules in the country. And pressure on the roster to prove this is still a championship machine instead of just a talented brand name. Because talent is not the question, the structure is. Sarah Strong is already one of the best players in America. Blanca Quinones is coming off a breakout season and shot nearly 40% from three. KK Arnold gives UConn speed, defensive pressure, and downhill creation. Ashlyn Shade gives them another perimeter weapon. Jenna El Alfie gives them size and interior presence. And now Geno adds two major international pieces to the future. Olivia Vukosa, the Gatorade National Girls Basketball Player of the Year, and Marine Dursis, a professional guard from France with high-level experience before ever stepping onto a college floor. So the ceiling is obvious. The question is whether the pieces fit quickly enough, because the schedule is designed to expose teams that are still figuring themselves out. The biggest challenge for UConn this season is not scoring. It is spacing. That sounds small until you realize spacing controls everything. Spacing controls driving lanes, spacing controls rebounding position, spacing controls how aggressively defenses can help. And for years, Azzi Fudd bent entire defenses just by standing on the floor. Now UConn has to recreate that pressure differently, not with one superstar shooter, but with collective movement, collective shot making, collective decision making. That is why players like Blanca Quinones and Ashlyn Shade become massive this season. Because if opponents can collapse into the paint without punishment, every possession becomes harder for Sarah Strong. And this season, Sarah Strong is not just a scorer. She is the engine. The offense will run through her passing, her reads, her ability to stretch defenses from the high post, and her abilities to punish mismatches before help arrives. That changes everything about how UConn plays. This is not going to be the old UConn offense built around elite guard isolation and bailout shot making. This version looks more fluid, more positionless, more dependent on timing. And honestly, that makes the early season games terrifying because timing takes months to perfect, and UConn does not get months. The South Carolina matchup on November 24th at Mohegan Sun is the game everybody will circle first, not because it automatically defines the season, but because it instantly reveals whether UConn's physical problems have actually been solved. South Carolina forces you into ugly basketball. They force rebounding battles. They force contact. They force half-court execution under pressure. And last time UConn saw that kind of pressure, the offense completely stalled. This season, UConn has to prove the new roster construction works differently. Can Olivia Vukosa handle physical post-play immediately? Can Jenna El Alfie anchor possessions without foul trouble? Can the wings rebound consistently enough to survive second-chance basketball? Can UConn keep the floor spread enough for Sarah Strong to operate it cleanly? That is what this game really measures. Not revenge, not headlines, functionality. Because if UConn survives South Carolina physically, the ceiling becomes real very fast. The scariest part of UConn's season might not even be South Carolina. It might be the road schedule, road trips to Louisville, Ohio State, Notre Dame, Florida State. That is brutal for a roster still discovering itself, because road games do not expose talent, they expose the organization. And that matters for this specific UConn team. Without Bueckers and Fudd controlling possessions, the margin for error becomes thinner. Now the offense has to survive pressure collectively. That means ball movement matters more. Transition defense matters more. Communication matters more. And suddenly every little mistake becomes amplified in hostile gyms. One bad rotation becomes a crowd eruption. One lazy outlet pass becomes a 6-point swing. One freshman hesitation becomes momentum. That is why that this season feels so fascinating. UConn is still talented enough to overwhelm teams, but can they stay composed when the structure gets attacked? That is different. Everybody assumes South Carolina is the biggest measuring stick, but Notre Dame might actually tell us more about UConn's future. Because Notre Dame attacks the exact things UConn is still building. Ball security, spacing discipline, defensive communication, late clock execution. That is where this roster gets tested hardest, not in pure talent, in organization. And that is why the Notre Dame matchup feels dangerous. Because if the spacing is inconsistent, Notre Dame can shrink the floor. If the ball movement slows down, Notre Dame can pressure passing lanes. If the guards hesitate, possessions become rushed. And if UConn cannot create clean offense under pressure, the ceiling changes immediately. But if they handle that environment, then suddenly the entire national conversation changes, because that would mean the new offensive structure is already ahead of schedule. Ohio State is the pace game, Florida State is the depth game. Ohio State forces you to defend in space. They force sprint recoveries, cross matches, transition communication. And for UConn, transition defense could quietly become one of the defining metrics of the season, because this roster wants to play faster. Severus Strong thrives in movement. KK Arnold thrives downhill. Ashlyn Shade is dangerous in early offense. But fast basketball only works if defensive recovery stays organized. That is the danger against Ohio State. Florida State creates a different problem, depth, because UConn lost frontcourt depth when Ice Brady transferred away from the program. Now every minute matters more for Jana El Alfi and Olivia Vukosa. Can they stay healthy? Can they stay out of foul trouble? Can they handle physical matchups repeatedly over a long season? That becomes critical, because if the frontcourt depth holds up, UConn looks complete. If it does not, every elite opponent starts attacking the same weakness. The Maryland game at Barclays Center feels different from the others, because this is not just a matchup, it is a showcase, a perception game, the kind of game where the entire country watches how you carry yourself, and that matters for UConn this season, because people already know the talent exists. The real debate is whether this roster already looks connected enough to win 6 straight tournament games. Against Maryland, the offense has to look organized. The defensive rotations have to look sharp. The spacing has to look natural. And Sarah Strong has to look like the best player on the floor without carrying every possession herself. That balances everything this year, because if UConn becomes too dependent on Strong, elite defenses will eventually trap the entire offense around her. But if the supporting cast consistently punishes defensive help, then this team becomes terrifying again. This might quietly become one of Geno's hardest coaching jobs in years, not because the roster lacks talent, because the roster has too many possible identities. UConn can play fast. They can play through the high post. They can pressure defensively. They can spread the floor. They can attack downhill. But now Geno has to decide which version becomes the primary identity before March arrives. Does he build around motion and spacing? Does he slow the game down and maximize Strong's passing? Does he lean into pressure defense and transition scoring? Does he protect the young front court with more zone principles? That experimentation is going to happen in real time against elite teams, which is exactly why these games matter so much. Every matchup becomes a laboratory, every adjustment becomes a clue, and by January the entire country will know whether UConn solved the puzzle. The season will ultimately come down to one thing. Can UConn create enough offensive pressure without relying on one superstar guard to rescue possessions? That is the modern question. Because championship teams today need layered offense. They need multiple creators, multiple spacing threats, multiple decision makers, and UConn is trying to build that in one offseason. If it works, this becomes one of the most dangerous teams in America by March. If it does not, they are still talented enough to win big games, but vulnerable enough for elite defenses to expose the cracks. That is why this season feels so important historically. Not because UConn disappeared, but because UConn is evolving, and evolution looks messy before it looks dominant. This season is bigger than rankings, bigger than preseason predictions, bigger than hype videos. This is the season that decides what the next era of UConn basketball actually looks like. Can Sarah Strong become the centerpiece of a championship offense? Can Blanca Quinones become the spacing weapon this roster desperately needs? Can Olivia Vukosa become physically ready faster than most freshmen? Can Maureen Durses give UConn the mature perimeter scoring they lost? Can Geno Auriemma build a new identity before the pressure peaks in March? That is the story, not revenge, not nostalgia, reinvention. Because the Dynasty reputation alone does not win games anymore. execution does, spacing does, depth does. And this schedule is designed to test every single part of it. So by the time March arrives, we are either going to be talking about the beginning of another UConn era, or the first season where, like the rest of the country, finally caught up.
Prime Field